Welcome to this course module. This course module is about forms, so forms on your HTML page, and how Angular can help you with those forms. Now, on first sight, it might be strange why you would need that help, right? Because a form is something you can simply submit to the server, but then keep in mind you're creating a single page application, so there is no submitting to the server. Instead, you will need to handle the form through Angular. And if you then want to submit something to the server, you will need to reach out via Angular's HTTP service, which we'll cover later in the course, to that server. So you will need to handle your form through Angular. And actually, Angular will help you handling it because not only will it allow you to get the values the user entered, it will also allow you to check if a form is valid. It will allow you to conditionally change the way the form is displayed, put some red borders around invalid controls. So Angular really ships with some powerful tools when it comes to working with forms. Let's take a closer look and let's understand what exactly Angular does for you, how it handles forms. So let's take a closer look at how Angular works together with forms. Consider this form. This is the HTML code of a form which you might use, and there is nothing Angular specific about this code. It's normal HTML code which you would place in your HTML documents to maybe display a form like this, with an input for the username and an input for the email address. Now, as mentioned in the last video, Angular's job now is to allow you to retrieve the values the user entered here, and also to check some other things like, is the form valid? Did the user enter valid information? And all that, of course, will happen in JavaScript, in TypeScript, so on the Angular 2 side of your app, you could say. So you somehow need to be able to parse the values the user enters, and you somehow need some JavaScript object representation of your form in your TypeScript code to work with. So this object could look something like this. It is more complex in reality, but these would be the key features we need. For example, we need to have the value of the form. And there it would be convenient if we would have key value pairs where the key refers to the name of an input, like for example, name or email as specified in the HTML code. And then it holds the values the user entered. This would make it super simple for you to work with these values in your TypeScript code and to do something with the values the user entered. It might also be helpful if some metadata was stored, like for example if the form is valid, and this would be changed to false, for example, if the email address wouldn't be a valid email address. This is what Angular does for you. It allows you, or it gives you actually, such a JavaScript object representation of your form, making it simple for you to retrieve user values and to see the state of the form and to work with it. Now in the next lectures, we're going to take a detailed look and we will understand how exactly it works, how we can configure it, what we can do with it, how we can reset it, and much more. Before diving in the actual code, it's super important to understand that Angular actually offers two approaches when it comes to handling forms. It offers the template-driven approach, which is called like this because there you simply set up your form in the template in HTML code, and Angular will automatically infer the structure of your form, will infer which controls your forms has, which inputs, and makes it easy for you to get started quickly. It also has a more complex approach, the reactive approach. There, you actually define the structure of the form in TypeScript code. You also set up the HTML code, and then you manually connect it, which might sound more complicated than it is in the end, and therefore it gives you greater control over it. You can fine-tune every little piece about your form. Now, in this module, we're going to have a look at both approaches. In the next videos, I'm going to start with the template-driven approach, which is fine for a lot of use cases, before we then dive into the more advanced reactive approach. So here I am on a simple example form just to get started. The code responsible for it is this HTML code in the template of my app component here, and you can find this code attached to this lecture here. Now, it's a simple form. We're going to expand it or enhance it with some features throughout this module, but to get started, this is just fine. Now, if we have a look at this HTML code, you will quickly realize that on the form tag here, I don't have the action attribute pointing to some route. I'm also not specifying the method attribute, which typically would be post. The reason for this is that this form should not get submitted to a server. I don't want a HTTP request to be the result of me clicking the submit button. Instead, as mentioned earlier, Angular should handle this form, and therefore I don't have an action on it. This of course means that right now if I hit the submit button, nothing happens. If you have a look at the refresh icon up there, you see it's not spinning, nothing happens because we're not actually sending a request. Well, we will work on this, but first let's understand what actually happens behind the scenes and how Angular infers such a forms, creates such a JavaScript object for us as it does when using the template-driven approach. Let's understand how we get Angular to create this form object for us. In the last video, we had a look at the basic setup of our form. Now let's understand how Angular creates such a JavaScript object representing our form in the template-driven approach. The great thing is, you don't have to do anything. Well, almost anything. Make sure that in your app module, you actually import the forms module added here to your imports array and have the import at the top of this file. As the name implies, this built-in module shipping with Angular includes a lot of forms-related functionalities and is actually needed to get this template-driven approach to work, to get this form creation by Angular to work. Now, by default in a CLI project, this should already be imported, so it should work fine. But again, I'm just highlighting it because it's super important that you have this import, otherwise the following steps will not work. With this imported, Angular will actually automatically create a form for you, so a JavaScript representation of that form, when it detects a form element in HTML code, like it does here. So you can think of that form element serving as a selector for some Angular directive, which then creates such a JavaScript representation of the form for you. Of course, you can't see that form representation as of now. And it would be very empty, because one thing does not happen automatically. Angular will not automatically detect your inputs in this form. And the simple reason for this is that whilst you could argue that it should be able to scan your HTML code and detect that you have an input here, and that you have a select dropdown here, you still might not want to add all these elements as controls to your form. So with control, I'm referring to what is in the JavaScript object. And again, not every input in your HTML code might be a control you want to have in your JavaScript form. Maybe you have a dropdown which value only changes something you view on the UI, but the input should not actually be part of what gets submitted. Maybe you use some third-party package which adds some custom form controls which are not labeled input, which don't use input as a selector, and then Angular would have no chance of detecting that this is a control of your form. So you still need to register controls manually. You need to tell Angular, hey, within that form element, what should be an actual control of my form? And this is what we're going to do now. Tell Angular, how does our form look like? Which controls do we want to have? In the template-driven approach, this is super simple. You simply pick the input which you want to add as a control, like this input here. And I'm just going to structure it a bit different to split it up over multiple lines to make it easier to read. And then you add ng model, like this. Now, you might already know ng model from the two-way data binding. And it actually is the same directive. In two-way data binding though, you saw that we used it with squared brackets and parentheses wrapping ng model. Now we will have a look at this later again, but for now let's add it without any parentheses, without any square brackets, just like this. This will be enough to tell Angular, hey, this input is actually a control of my form. So ng-model in the end is a directive made available in the forms module, something I mentioned earlier in the course when we had a look at two-way data binding. This is key to understand. You can use it to get two-way data binding, but it actually is part of a bigger module with more features, giving you full control over forms. Now for this to work, for this to be recognized as a control in your form, we need to give Angular one other piece of information: the name of this control. Right now it would see, okay, this input should be part of the JavaScript object representation of this form. So whatever the user enters here as a value should be the value of of this control. But what's the name of that control? We need to give that information to Angular, and we do this by adding the normal HTML attribute name. So name is nothing Angular too specific. Name is the default attribute you can add to any HTML control. Now here the name might be username because that is what we can enter in this input. And with this control will be registered in this JavaScript representation of the form. Now I'll do the same for the email. Restructure it so that it's easier to read, add ng-model, and add a name, like for example, email here. Well, and the same is true for the select here, which is just another type of HTML input. Here we can also add ng-model, and we can add a name, like secret, because I'm asking for a secret question here. And with that, we registered all the controls. Of course, we can't see that much though. Well, that is something we're going to have a look at in the next lecture when we see how we can submit such a form and therefore how we can see these key value pairs representing what the user entered into which input. In the last lecture, we configured our form here. We added some controls by placing ng-model on the inputs. Now let's make this form submittable so that we can actually see what the user entered. For this, I'll go to my app component. I already do have a method here which we will use later. Let's ignore it for now. And I'll add a new method on submit maybe. This should be triggered whenever this form is submitted by the user. In onSubmit, I want to output whatever the user entered. Well, first of all, we need to call this method. So back in the template, how can we call onSubmit? Now you might think that a good place would be on a click listener on this button here at the bottom, right? Because this is the button we click when we want to submit the form. However, this is not the best place to do it. Keep in mind that this button here is of type submit, so if we click it as it is placed inside of a HTML form element, something else will happen. The default behavior of HTML will be triggered here, to call it like this. If you have a button in a form element, this button will submit the form, will send a request normally, but besides that, it will also trigger a JavaScript event, the submit event, that's built into JavaScript, built into HTML, you could say. Angular takes advantage of this and gives us a directive we can place on this form element as a whole. It is called ng-submit, and it actually only gives us one event we can listen to. So let's wrap it in parentheses. This event, made available by the ng-submit directive, will be fired whenever this form is submitted, so whenever this default behavior is triggered. And here we can call onSubmit like this, and to show you that this works, I will simply go into onSubmit and log submitted here, just like that. Now if we save this and let it recompile, let's go back and let's open up the developer tools. And if I now hit the submit button, you see submitted here on the right, because indeed the form gets submitted. Now it would be nice to see the actual values of the form though, to see that form object. And to see it, we have to go back to our template because we're in the template-driven approach. So as a rule of thumb, everything you do it in the template. Everything you want to change about this form, you want to add as functionality, you do it in the template. On this form object, we want to get access to the form created by Angular. Now you learned about local references you can place on HTML elements to get access to them. So we could place #F on the form element, and now we could access this form element on, well, the F reference in our template, and we could pass F as an argument to the onSubmit method and print it there. So now we know that we get the form, and actually this will be of type element ref as we learned. So if we import element ref and make this of type element ref here, and we output the form here, so this element. If we now go back to this and hit submit, yeah, we indeed see that form object. We see some strange classes here, I will come back to them. But that still is not what we want. It's not a JavaScript object created by Angular. But this object is there, we just need to know how to get to it. And there actually is a trick, you could call it, but it's no trick, it's the default way to get access to this automatically created object. You set this local reference equal to something. Now we haven't done that yet, but we can set it equal to something exposed by this form here. Keep in mind, the form element is kind of a selector for a directive built into Angular, which will create this JavaScript object automatically. And then it will expose some data we can fetch here on this form element. We can get access to it by writing ngForm here between the quotation marks. So this might look super strange, but what this in the end does is it tells Angular, hey, please give me access to this form you created automatically. That's just something you have to keep in mind. This is how you get access to the form, to this JavaScript object created by Angular automatically. So therefore, here where we get this form, we now still pass it. Now this will no longer be an element ref, so let's remove this type here. Instead, this will now be of ngForm. So let's import ngForm from @AngularForms. And it kind of makes sense that it is of type ngForm because that is what we're accessing here. This automatically created form. Now let's print it to the console one more time, and let's actually enter something into these fields to see that it worked. If I now type submit here, you see that now we get an ngForm object, an object which we certainly didn't create. And there we have a lot of properties. We'll have a closer look at those later. We also do have a value property. And if we expand this, we indeed see a couple of key value pairs here where we have the names of the controls. So the names we set up here on the name attribute like username and email. We find them here, and then the values the user entered. And this is how we can submit such a form and how we can also get access to the form object created by Angular. We also see that our setup of controls also worked. In the last lecture, we learned how we can submit a form created by Angular and how we can access to this object Angular created for us. Now we had a look at the value property, which stores the input of the user in key value pairs. We see that we also have a lot of our properties. And that's pretty cool about this JavaScript object, about the form handling by Angular. It allows us to really understand the state of our form. We can see which controls we registered here on the controls object, email, secret, and username, and each control is of type form control, of course a type made available by Angular, where each control then has a couple of properties, mostly the same properties we have on the overall form though. And therefore let's go back to that overall form. For example, properties like dirty, disabled, enabled, errors, and most of the properties should be pretty self-explanatory. Dirty, for example, is true because we changed something about that form. If I reload the page and submit it now, you will see that dirty is false because I didn't type into any input. So therefore, of course, dirty is false. Disabled would be true if the form was disabled for some reason. Invalid is false because we haven't added any validators, so it isn't invalid, it is indeed valid. You do have the valid property down here too, so the form is valid right now. We will later learn how to add validators to make sure that a valid email address has to be entered, for example. And we also have touched, for example, to see did we click into some of the fields. The difference to dirty would be that for dirty we have to change the field, have to change the value of a field. For touch we simply have to click into it and now it would be touched. And you will later learn how these properties can be helpful in changing the user experience. For example, disabling the submit button if the form is not valid. I will come back to this later. It's important to understand that you have all these properties, and definitely feel free to dive into the output we logged here and understand which properties you have, how they change, which properties the individual controls have, and so on. In the last lectures, we learned how we can register controls and how we can submit the form and also which properties this form has. Now, right now, we submit the form by passing the form, which we get via ngForm here, to the onSubmit method. This is absolutely fine and probably the approach you will use in many use cases. I just want to bring some other approach to your attention. You don't have to submit it here. Remember the component section where we learned about add viewChild, which allowed us to access a local reference, an element controlled or which holds a local reference in our TypeScript code? Well, in the end, we do just have such a local reference here. And whilst it might not point to an element ref, but to the ngForm object, it still is a local reference in our template. So we can also use add viewChild here. So I will simply comment out this onSubmit method here so that we have it in the code you can find attached to this module and show you an alternative approach. In this alternative approach, I will use add viewChild, this decorator you learned about in the component section. So make sure to import it from add Angular core. And I want to get access to the element which has the local reference f on it. So I pass f as a string as an argument to viewChild. And then I could simply store this in a variable named signup form, any name you like, which will be of type ngForm, of course. Now in onSubmit, I could output this signup form like this. And you should see that if I now submit this again, we still have this form. And I can also enter something so that we can see that this works too if we have a look at the value. So this gives us access to the very same form without passing it to onSubmit. This is especially useful if you need to access the form not just at the point of time when you submit it, but also earlier. And I will show a use case for this in a later lecture. For now, let's keep in mind that this is another way of getting access to the form in our TypeScript code, a perfectly valid way of getting access. And before diving deeper into why this might be useful or when we could use that, let's actually understand how we can control the validity of the form. So to determine whether the form is valid, if we enter the valid email address here or not. Because right now I can submit anything, no matter if this is invalid, if this is empty. It would be nice if you could add such validation and take advantage of the tools Angular gives us there to possibly also enhance the user experience by placing a red border around invalid elements or something like this. We'll have a look at validation in the next lectures. So as mentioned at the end of the last lecture, it would be nice if we could validate the user input, something very important in any app you build. Whilst you should still validate input on the server, as the frontend can always be tricked, you can greatly enhance user experience by also validating the input here. For example, we want to make sure that none of the fields here is empty and that the email address actually is a valid email address. So let's go back to our app component, to the HTML file, to the template, and see how we can add such validators. Now, since we use the template-driven approach, we can only add them in the template. And here we can, for example, add required to our username input. Now, required is a default HTML attribute you can add to an input. Here, however, Angular will detect it, so it acts as a selector for a built-in directive shipping with Angular, and it will automatically configure your form, you could say, to take this into account to make sure that now this will be treated as invalid if, well, it is empty. And on the email, we can, for example, therefore also add required, and there also is an email directive you can add. Now, email is not a built-in HTML attribute, it still is a directive, and keep in mind, required is only treated as a selector for an Angular directive here. An email is simply another directive made available by Angular, which makes sure that this is actually a valid email address. So now if we save this, and we have a look at our form here and I submit it. I can still submit it because we haven't set up anything which would prevent us from doing so. But if we have a look at it and check the valid attribute, you see it as false. And if I enter something here, so it's filled, but the email address is still not valid, you see that still valid is false. Only if I turn this into a valid email address here, only in this case. Now if we submit it, now you see valid is true. So now Angular tracks the state of this form and correctly informs us or gives us a chance of querying it whether this form is valid or not. And actually this does not only work on form level. If we dive into the actual controls, you see that on the email control, we also have a valid attribute, which is true. So it tracks this on a per control level and then also on a form level. Now, there also is another place where it tracks this and helps us. If we inspect this email element here in the HTML code, you see that it adds a couple of classes because the form control class here is by us. It's a bootstrap class to give it some styling. But ng-dirty, ng-touched, and ng-valid, these are not classes added by us, and the ng at the beginning makes it pretty clear who is responsible for adding these classes. Now watch these classes if I remove the @ sign here. You saw that ng-invalid was added and ng-valid was removed. So Angular dynamically adds some classes giving us information, some CSS classes, giving us information about the state of the individual control here. Whether it is dirty or not, so whether we did change the initial value, whether it is touched or not, so whether we clicked into it or not, and whether it is valid or not. Now with that information, we can style these inputs conditionally. So let's in the next lecture take advantage of the fact that Angular tracks the state of the validity and of the form overall and change the styling and the behavior, the user experience with that form. In the last lecture, we found out that Angular tracks the state of each control of the form, whether it's valid and so on, and conditionally also adds these CSS classes. Now with that information, we can go back to our form and you take advantage of it. Before diving into these CSS classes, the easiest way of taking advantage is down here on the submit button. Let's disable the button if the form is not valid. So I'll just split this over multiple lines and add some property binding. I want to bind to the disabled property, which will set the disabled state of this button to true or false depending on some condition, and I will specify the condition here. Now I could say true here to always disable it. That of course is not super useful. Instead here I want to check whether the form, remember we do have access to it on this f local reference here. So if this form is valid, or to be precise, if it is not valid. So if this form is not valid, the button should be disabled. And we can actually see this once this reloads, that now the button is disabled, and only if I enter some valid values here, I can hit the submit button again. So this is the first improvement in place. The second improvement is to take advantage of these CSS classes. We do get these classes added automatically, so we can now go to the style sheet of this app component, and we could say that on ng invalid, we want to give it a red border, so 1 pixel solid red. Sounds like a solid idea, doesn't it? Well, if we do this, you see everything's red now. The 2 controls, but also the overall form. The reason for this is that our overall form is also invalid, and that Angular also adds the ng invalid class, CSS class, to the form element. So a better approach would be to make sure that it is not added to the form. Now there are a couple of ways of doing this, and it's all just pure CSS logic. One idea would be that we want to be inside of the form element, but then it would still place these red borders around grouping divs. We will have a look at what I mean with this later. So the best way is to simply be explicit that we want to add it on inputs, for example. And of course, you could also add select here, so input with ng invalid or select with ng invalid, and whichever elements you have. Just be creative here. There are different ways of achieving this goal. In the end, you just want to make sure that the border is applied to the right controls. Now with this in place, we see that now we only have a red border around the invalid controls, but we do have the border right from the start, which is also not great because I at least want to give the user the chance of changing it before showing a warning, showing that it's wrong. So a better approach might be to make sure that we only add a red border to an input which has the CSS class ng invalid and also the CSS class ng touched, so that the user has to at least click into it. Now by default, we don't see anything red, even though the form is invalid. But if you click in there and decide, yeah, I'm done, this is my value, well, now you see we have a red border because now we had a chance of changing it, we didn't change it, it is invalid, and we want to show this. And with that, we're taking advantage of this form state handled by Angular. We disable the button and we show a visual feedback to the user. Now you could of course go much further. You could also add a warning message below this input here, for example, and output, please enter a valid value, or be more precise than that of course, and add ngIf to conditionally show this if the input value is wrong. Well, this gives us one additional problem though. How do we determine whether this input here or this control here does hold a wrong value? We'll take a closer look in the next lecture.